In Psalm 55 tonight, we've been looking at God's characteristics that He reveals to us through the writers of the Psalms. That's what we've been looking at. We looked at the fact that He's a shepherd, a provider, a redeemer, and on and on and on. A rock. All these things that He has taught us through David and Asaph and the other writers of Scripture. Tonight I want to look at the character of David in the Psalms, because every time we go to one of these Davidic Psalms, it seems as if David is just without error. Like David had a problem. He firmed up his feet in the truths that he knew. He turned to Yahweh. He trusted God through it all, and he never ever faltered in his faith in the fact that God would provide and deliver him. Psalm 55 paints a slightly different picture of David. Now, I'm not going to go so far tonight as to say that David is in sin in the first few verses of this psalm. It doesn't matter to me. That's between him and his father. What I do know is that when this serious situation came upon David, he had a very, very emotional response to it. And I wonder if any of us, any of you, me, when we have very, very serious situations hit us, if we ever have emotional responses to them, I'll call them reactions rather than responses, like David does in Psalm 55. So I'm doing this because I told you at the end last time, I'm not trying to bring David down. I'm not trying to say, well, David was a this and a that. Not at all. I'm trying to let you know that this great King David was human just like we are. He had as many faults. He had as many frailties. He made as many mistakes. He sinned just as much as you do and just as much as I do. And that's why we're in Psalm 55. Psalm 55 is a lament psalm. I don't think I've ever, in the time that we've been going through these psalms, actually defined lament. What is it to lament? This is a personal, an individual lament psalm. There's one man, his name is David, and he is crying out to God. He's pleading with God to change his circumstance. We've all done that. Lament means to mourn aloud. It also means to express grief or sorrow or distress. And David is in trouble. David has an old friend, and I mean an old close friend. And I'll give you an example in my life. I'm talking about a friend like Clay Jackson is to me. I picked Clay so that I don't hurt anybody's feelings in the church, but I got a lot of close friends in this church too. But you all know Clay. You know we're fellow pastors. We're trying to do this work together. And David's problem is that someone that was as close to him and worshiped God together with him in the temple, someone that was that close, turned on him. And so David's emotions here are very, very high. His language is very, very strong. He is in the greatest type of grief and sorrow and distress you can imagine, because he has been betrayed by someone who never, ever would have been thought to be a betrayer of King David. I want you to look at Psalm 55 with me, verse 13. Because he doesn't say it until he gets down to verse 13 that this is the reason his soul is in such distress. It's because of this betrayal. And this man, I'm going to name him in a minute, this man who's betrayed Jesus has brought his entourage with him. He's got other enemies of David, and he has come seeking to kill David. I'm going to show you a verse in just a minute that says that. In Psalm 55 verse 13 it says, "But it is you, a man my equal, my companion." I'll tell you what these words mean in a minute. A man my equal, my companion, my familiar friend. You see why I picked Clay? He just fits these categories. Who had sweet fellowship together. We walked in the house of God, in the throng, in the multitudes of people that were there. You and I walked together. We worshiped God side by side. And you betrayed me of all people. You want to kill me now? And that's what has led to David's extreme duress and his reaction to the situation. I want to show you who I think this is. Look at 2 Samuel 16 with me. You'll have to turn to it because I don't have it on the board. Joshua judges Ruth, 1 and 2 Samuel. If you're in 1 Kings, go backwards. In 2 Samuel chapter 16, verse 23, I'm going to introduce a character to you. His name is Ahithophel. And I believe that this is the man who was David's equal, his companion, his familiar friend, the one who walked together with him in the house of God in sweet fellowship and worship of Yahweh, the one true God. Ahithophel. In 2 Samuel 16:23, let's read it. It says, "Now the advice of Ahithophel, which he gave in those days," now this is after David, but look what it says. "The advice of Ahithophel, which he gave in those days, was as if one had inquired of the oracle of God," as if God himself had spoke the advice. That's how good Ahithophel's and pure Ahithophel's advice was. So was all the advice of Ahithophel, both with David and with Absalom. Remember, Absalom is David's son. And Absalom is David's son who drove his father out of Jerusalem because Absalom wanted the throne. He wanted to usurp his father's authority and take the throne from his father. And Ahithophel, who had been the equal of David, a counselor of King David, turned on David and went and aligned himself with Absalom to overthrow David. Look, turn back with me a chapter to 2 Samuel 15:31. Let's read that. More about Ahithophel. In the days of David, Ahithophel's counsel was as if God was speaking himself. In 2 Samuel 15, verse 31, it says, if these eyes will find it, "Then someone told David," and this is what they said to David, "Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom." And David said, "O Lord, I pray, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness." Because what was the counsel of Ahithophel before? Like the very words of God. And so David prays, if he's aligned himself with my son, who's trying to kill me and take my throne, then turn Ahithophel's counsel into gibberish. Now one more, look at 2 Samuel 17, all in the same area. Look at 2 Samuel chapter 17, verses 1 through 3. You say, well, that doesn't prove that Ahithophel wanted to kill David. Why would Psalm 55 be about Ahithophel? Look at what it says here. "Moreover, Ahithophel said to Absalom," Ahithophel, who was David's counsel, his right-hand man, says to Absalom, David's son, who wants to usurp the authority, take the throne, and kill his father. Ahithophel says, "I'll do it." Ahithophel said to Absalom, "Now let me choose 12,000 men, and I will arise and pursue David tonight." You see the depths of the betrayal. You're my friend. I count on you. You count on me. We walk through life together. We worship God together. David is in turmoil over this. "I'll come upon him while he is weary and weak. I'll make him afraid, and all the people who are with him will flee, and I will kill only the king." You see the problem when you get to Psalm 55? And David says, my close friend, my equal, my companion, my familiar friend, nobody else fits this bill in the Bible. Nobody else is identified who fits the bill as one who was David's equal and then turned on him and wanted to kill him. You could bring up the relationship that David had with Saul's son Jonathan, but it never went south. It was never a bad relationship. There's only one in the Bible that we know of that this could be, and that is this man Ahithophel. This is how Psalm 55 is laid out. In verses 1 through 8, David gives his initial complaint, and this is where we'll spend most of our time tonight. Because David is in great grief and reacts to the fact that he has a close friend who's betrayed him. In the next several verses, 9 to 15, David speaks to God. He gives his petition to God against his enemies. "This is what I want you to do, God." We see that in verses 9 to 15. This is what David is asking God to do to Ahithophel and the men that are with him, the conspirators against the king. And in the end of the chapter, in verse 16 to verse 23, we see David's thoughts come into a clearer focus, and his confidence is restored in God as his deliverer. And this is what we'll see from verse 1. We'll see a change in names of God in verse 1 and in verse 16. When David looks to God as the promise-keeping God, the God who's made promises and will keep them, what name does he use? We've talked about this. What name of God does he use? Does he call him El, or does he call him by another name? He calls him Yahweh when he makes promises, and he keeps his promises. And not until verse 16, when David settles himself, when he's got it off his chest, if you will, when he set his peace with God, not until verse 16 do David's thoughts settle down, and he realizes, I'm speaking to my God, Yahweh. And once he starts calling God Yahweh, it's back to, you are my refuge, you are my rock, you are my deliverer. You're the one in whom I trust. So that's what this looks like. Let's look at it, Psalm 55. So in verse 16, we see God becomes Yahweh in David's eyes. The promise-keeping provider, the promise-keeping deliverer, the promise-keeping defender, the promise keeper. We don't see that until verse 16. For many verses, we see David reacting the same way we do often when we have troubles in life. Psalm 55 for the choir director. I tell you, the Psalms are songs on stringed instruments. A maskil of David. We're not exactly sure. I say we as if I have a say in this. But the experts, the Hebrew experts, the rabbis are not exactly sure what maskil means, but they do believe that it's a musical term, probably referring to a type of music, a type of a song, or a type of a poem. That's as far as we'll go with that word. David gives 3 commands. Now listen to this. David commands God. David makes a command of God 3 times in the first 2 verses. Brave relationship. Intimate relationship. Give ear is a command from David to God. Give ear to my prayer, O God. Not Yahweh, God. El, E-L. Give ear to my prayer, O God, and do not hide yourself from my supplication. Give ear is the Hebrew word azan. It means to listen or to hear. David is commanding God to pay attention to him. I'm speaking, God. I need you to listen. We don't go too far with the command, but the fact is, it's in the imperative mood in the Hebrew. David is commanding God, hear me. That's the level of his distress, that he's even commanding God in this time and in his life on these days. Give heed, he says in verse 2, give heed, another command. Give heed to me and answer me, another command. You rarely see David speak to God this way. He's reacting to his situation. He says, answer me, the command. It means to reply or to answer. It means to respond to a request. It's the Hebrew word anah, A-N-A-H. David is commanding God to hear me and respond. Do something. Amazing. And I'm not, like I said at the beginning, I'm not going to say that David was in sin. It's between him and God. I don't know the relationship that they had. I do know I have a God who can take a lot. Sometimes we face situations. I mean, we're not told here that David was in sin. It's part of the Word of God. It's a psalm. It's a song that the children of Israel would sing. He wrote it for the choir director. I want you to put this to music so that the congregation of Israel can sing it. Would David be highlighting his sin? I don't know. That's between him and God, like I said. But David is using very strong language with God. I don't recommend that. You do what you want to between you and God, but I don't recommend that. But what would be different? Let me ask you this. What would be different? Go to the story. See rabbit trail, 30 seconds. Peter. Jesus is walking on water. Peter says, Lord, if it's you, call me out of the boat. Let me walk on the water too. So Jesus says, Alpha, come. It is me. Come. So Peter jumps out of the water. Peter's walking on water in this storm-tossed water. And only when Peter started realizing, I can't do this. I cannot walk on water. I'm going to drown in this stormy water. He falls into the water. And what does Peter command Jesus? Save me. That was a command. What did Jesus say? Don't talk to me that way. Is that what he said? Or did he obey the command because one of his sheep was in peril? He reached out, he grabbed his hand, he picked him up. So do we see this in the Bible that people make commands of God in very, very distressing times in life when your life is at stake? Yeah, we see it in the Old Testament and the New. He says, give heed to me and answer me. And then he says, I am restless in my complaint and am surely distracted. Restless and distracted. I'll show you those words in a minute. A lot of words tonight because I want you to see what David is saying. What is he feeling? What are the emotions behind his close friend having betrayed him and on his tail trying to kill him? What would your emotions be? Just trying to say David's human like the rest of us. I'm restless in my complaint and am surely distracted because of the voice of the enemy, Ahithophel and his people, because of the pressure of the wicked. For they bring down trouble upon me, and in anger they bear a grudge against me. Now, what grudge could Ahithophel had against David? I'm not sure. But I'll offer a guess. It may be, and this is capital M, capital A, capital Y, it may be, and some of the rabbis believe this because of a verse in the Bible, that Ahithophel had a son named, I think it was Aniel, A-N-I-E-L, something like that. And in another place in the Bible, it talks about a man named, or a woman named Bathsheba, and it says that her father's name was Aniel. So it might be that this Ahithophel is a generation older than David and is the grandfather of Bathsheba, whose marriage to Uriah the Hittite was destroyed by David. May have held that grudge. That may be, like I said, that's a long shot, but it's interesting enough for me to say it to you because it's in the commentaries that may be a truth. Maybe. But he's in anguish here. He says, I'm restless in my complaint and am surely distracted. The word for restless is ravad, R-A-V-A-D. What is David saying? To be restless means to be worried and uneasy. Anybody in here ever have a circumstance that makes you worried and uneasy? Oh, come on. David, he's human. Worried and uneasy. Well, this is King David. I thought he met every circumstance in his life by the words, you are my God, my rock, my refuge, my high tower, my fortress. Not all the time. Sometimes it started here and it moved into you are my rock and my high tower and my refuge and my fortress. But this is where it started. It's very bold of David, God the Holy Spirit, but David to write these words and record them because it doesn't paint David in a great light. It paints him as merely human. I'm very happy for it. It says, he is restless in my complaint and am surely distracted. Distracted is the word havim, H-A-V-I-M, and it means to be out of one's senses. To wander about. It also means to be deeply agitated, especially from emotion. David got emotional? I thought King David always thought with this mentality. I thought David was always toeing the line. I thought David went to the scrolls, the scriptures first, the law of Moses. I thought he never made these kind of... I thought he wasn't human. I thought he was above me. It's not what the Bible says. It's not what David recorded in Psalm 55. He was deeply agitated. He was having an emotional reaction to Ahithophel having betrayed him and knocking on his door to try to kill him. And it's even as if he was out of his senses. Let's just keep going. Again, what's causing this worried uneasiness and deep agitation in David? The enemy. He says, because of the voice of the enemy and the pressure of the wicked. Anybody have an enemy or pressure in this world from the wicked? Anybody at your workplace forced to do something, looked at as the fool, looked at as the intolerant Christian when it comes time for mandatory donations to this fund, when it comes time for Gay Pride Week, when it comes time for whatever? Who's the one that's made to look like the idiot? This guy, the Christian. None of us have faced what David is facing here, but we have pressures of our own, and we respond many times in restlessness and in distraction. And sometimes the pressures come upon us are so grave that we can almost feel like we've lost our mind. I've been in that. I've been there. I've been there. The destructive effects is what David is frustrated about. The destructive effects of the wickedness and the evil acts is what has David concerned. Because look what it keeps saying here. David is not at this point using Yahweh as his refuge. He's not. His entire focus is on his circumstance. And it's a grave circumstance. But his entire focus is on his circumstance. Look what it says. Verse 4, my heart is in anguish within me, and the terrors of death have fallen upon me. Anguish is the word heal, H-I-L, C-H-I-L if you want. Heal, you got to throw that throat in it. And it means to be in labor. It's a word that speaks of a pregnant woman giving birth. That's the word that David chose. My heart is as if I am in labor. The pains, the distresses, the physical stresses of labor. It means to writhe and to shake and to tremble like a woman trying to have a child. Strong language he's using here. He's having a really, really, really hard day. So he says, my heart is as if I'm a woman in labor, and the terrors of death have fallen upon me. The word terrors, fright, horror. I'm going to use a word here. Maybe you'll recognize it. An overwhelming feeling of fear and anxiety. Anxiety? Anybody? Anybody fight anxiety? I do. And here David, in this time of his life, says that the overwhelming feeling of the fear of an impending death, knowing that Ahithophel, if he gets to me, if his men get to me, it's not going to be a nice, clean thing. I don't know how they intend to kill me, but it may not be painless. And the fear of going through a death like that has terrorized King David. In verse 5 he says, fear and trembling have come upon me. Horror has overwhelmed me. It's all right there. It's very good English translations. I just offer the words to add a little more color to it. Fear is the Hebrew word yirah, and it means to be afraid. That's what it means, to be afraid. He uses another word for trembling, ra'ad. It means a shaky emotion, quaking or trembling. And David is saying all of these things were him. His soul was quivering inside his body. He was terrified. He was scared. He was anxious. He was nervous. He was terrified. He was as if he was a woman in labor, in the end stages of labor. And he's demanding that God hear him and act to get him out of this fix. And I say it so strongly because I've been right there. How was David handling his circumstances then? We have to ask that question. He wanted to escape rather than to walk through with God. Lord, show me the way through this. David wanted out. How many have been there? I don't want this to go on. I want God to miraculously heal me of cancer. I don't want to go through the chemo. I don't want to go through the radiation. I don't want to lose my hair. Can you imagine if I lost my hair? That's a joke. You want out. You want the miracle. You pray for the miracle. Not, oh Lord, give me the strength. And I am not saying not at all, not for 1 second. Rick King could go through that. No, you kidding? I'd be just like David. I'd be begging God and commanding God to fix me. I would react the same way. I'm human, just like him. I love this guy because I love this guy, King David. What does he say in verse 6? Get me out of here. I don't want to walk through it with you. I don't want you to show me the righteous path. None of that. I want out. He says, I said, David's pleading with God, oh, that I had wings like a dove. I would fly away and be at rest. It's interesting that David would choose a dove. David wants to escape this situation instead of waiting on the Lord to deliver him. But isn't it interesting that he'd choose a dove? David doesn't want to fight. David doesn't want to be a hawk. David doesn't want to be a bird of prey, an eagle, to go out and defend himself against Ahithophel. David wants to be that dove, that low-flying, fast bird that gets away from the enemy. He doesn't want the fight, doesn't want any part of it. He wants to be transported by God from here somewhere else and right now. That's what he's asking for. That's what he wishes he could do. That he of his own power, he wishes that he had wings like a dove and he would fly away, and when he flew away, he would be at rest. True or false? If he were to go to what he considers his place of refuge that is not Yahweh, would he be at rest? He would not be at rest. Keep reading what it says here. David, who's completely absorbed by his circumstances right now. A tough circumstance, one I hope I never have to get close to. Verse 7 says, behold, I would wander far away. I would lodge in the wilderness. He wants to get out of town. There's no other way to say it. He wants to leave the place of danger. And I've been there too. David's human. He's simply human with human weaknesses and tendencies. Look at what it says in verse 8. Where would he fly to? This is a very interesting verse. Where would David choose to fly to? He wants to be a dove. He wants to fly away. He wants to go out into the wilderness. And look where he says he would fly to. I would hasten quickly. I would get there quickly. I would hasten to my place of refuge. My place of refuge from the stormy wind and the tempest. He calls what Ahithophel and his men are doing a storm and a tempest that's come upon him. And he says, if only I could fly away to my place of refuge. And don't you say, isn't something in your head saying, wait a minute. I thought David always said Yahweh, the one true God, was his refuge. What's this place of refuge? You want to fly into the safety under the wings, the everlasting arms of the wings of God? Well, that's a good place to be, but that's not what he's saying here. He wants to escape and fly away to a place of refuge. But this is the David that we normally read about in the Psalms. O Lord my God, in you I have taken refuge. That's not what Psalm 55 says. Save me from all those who pursue me and deliver me. That's not what Psalm 55 says. Not so far. Or he will tear my soul like a lion, dragging me away while there's none to deliver. But who does he put all his trust in? Yahweh Elohim, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's David of Psalm 7. A great follower of God, trusting God to save him. But in Psalm 55, so far, that's not David. He's in anguish. He's terrified. He's trembling. He's quivering. He's as if he's a woman in the late stages of labor. He is terrified by his circumstance. In verse 9, we get to the petitions. What does David tell God he wants him to do? Confuse, O Lord, divide their tongues or their languages. What does that make you think about? Confuse their tongues, confuse their languages. What does that make you think about? The Tower of Babel. It's interesting that David would hearken back to that Tower of Babel thing, because what happened when God confused the languages at the tower? Their plans disappeared. It was that God defeated the enemies, his own enemies, because when he confused their languages, they could no longer gather. They could no longer work together. They could no longer build this tower, this monument to anti-God thinking. They couldn't do it anymore. So David says, confuse their languages, divide their tongues, for I have seen violence and strife in the city. What city did Absalom force David to flee from? Where does the king of Israel reside? Jerusalem. So what city would David be talking about? Jerusalem. And since David has left Jerusalem, what does he see in Jerusalem? What is he hearing about is happening in Jerusalem? Because of people like Absalom, his son, and Ahithophel, who's giving counsel to Absalom. What does David see? This is what he sees. Verse 10, it says, day and night they go around upon her walls, and iniquity, sin, and mischief are in her midst. Destruction is in her midst. Oppression and deceit do not depart from her streets. It wasn't like that when David was the king, seated on the throne in Jerusalem. His son Absalom and his old friend Ahithophel have ruined the morality, the ethic, the God-fearing in the city of Jerusalem. Verse 12, he says, for it's not an enemy who reproaches me. Then I could bear it. If it was a Philistine who's come up against me to try to kill me, I don't want to be a dove that flies away. Lord, let me be a hawk. Let me be a bird of prey who comes down on the Philistines to destroy them. That's what you do with an enemy, you fight. But he says, I could bear it if it was just another enemy of mine. The king of Israel would have had innumerable enemies against him. Nor is it one, he says, nor is it one who hates me, who has exalted himself against me. Then I could hide myself from him. But it's you, and here we get back to the verse we opened with. It's you, a man my equal, my companion. Companion is a word that means confidant. Someone you trust with your innermost thoughts, your innermost struggles. Somebody that's not going to judge you. Somebody that listens and tries to counsel and guide. That's who Ahithophel was to David. I got a man that's a generation older than me that I consider a very wonderful, intimate confidant. And that's, I think, who Ahithophel was to David. That's what he just said. You were my equal. You were my confidant. My familiar friend. What's a familiar friend? It's a person you know well and regard with affection and trust. Verse 14, he says, we had sweet fellowship together when we walked in the house of God and among the assembly. You imagine worshiping God in the temple grounds, bringing sacrifice together. It's the most intimate thing you can do, by the way. That's why he mentions it. You were my confidant. That's good. You were my familiar friend. You were well regarded and trusted by me. That's good. But this was a like-minded Jew. This was a man who believed in Yahweh the way that David did. This is a man who worshiped side by side with David. This is intimacy. So he says in verse 15, let death come deceitfully upon them. This is his request of God. It's pretty strong language, isn't it? There is a type of psalm called an imprecatory psalm. Imprecatory. And that's when the psalmist, and David writes several of them, calls on God to destroy his enemy. I mean, to utterly destroy them, wipe them out of the book of life. He says things like that. Let their name never be uttered on earth again. Imprecatory psalms, and he's written several of them. And for this little bit here, that's exactly what he does. He's telling God, destroy them, utterly wipe them out. Let death come deceitfully upon them. Let them go down alive to Sheol. They want to destroy me and kill me in a heinous way. I want you, God, to destroy them in a heinous way. I want it to be painful. He says, let them go down alive to Sheol. That's a bad death. That's not putting a sword through them one time. That's a bad death David has called God to do. It's King David. Just wonder if you ever knew King David made statements like this. For evil is their dwelling in their midst. So David is telling God that I'm not just mad at them. They are evil, ungodly people. And I want you to destroy them, to wipe them off this planet, never to be heard from again. And in verse 15, things get better for David. His confidence is restored in Yahweh. Verse 16, he started in verse 1 calling God, God, El. And in verse 16, after getting this all off his chest, the way a man named Job did in the book of Job, he had a lot on his chest he needed to get off. He's finally calmed down, at least a bit. He remembers who God is to him, a promise-keeping God. And he goes back into proper worship and he says, as for me, I want you to destroy them, but as for me, I shall call upon God. They are not calling upon you, but I will call upon you, and Yahweh, the Lord, will save me. Oh, this is a new David. This is a David that's gotten it off his chest. He's gone through the reaction, and now he's thinking clearly about his circumstance, and he's responding to who God is and what God will do. He will redeem my soul in peace. Isn't that a far cry from when in verse 4, my heart is in anguish within me and the terrors of death have fallen upon me, and now all of a sudden, when he gets his focus off of this and Ahithophel and the men that are trying to kill him, and his focus goes up to Yahweh, the Lord God of Abraham, the Lord God that came to David through Nathan and told him wonderful things about his kingdom being eternal. Now David is focusing on this Yahweh, and he says, my Yahweh will redeem my soul in peace. You see the calmness that's come over David now that he's refocused on God, on Yahweh, the promise maker and the promise keeper. He'll redeem my soul in peace from the battle which is against me. All of a sudden, it's not, I need to fly away like a dove. I want to go to my place of refuge. You don't hear that now. Now it's God, Yahweh, going to do this for him. Yahweh will redeem my soul in peace from the battle which is against me, for they are many who strive with me. Ahithophel wasn't alone. In verse 19, he says, God will hear and answer them. What does he say in verse 1 and 2? He's commanding God to hear him and to answer him. And now he says, oh, God will hear and answer. I don't have to command him to do that. I have to have a proper perspective of who God is and who I am and approach him properly. And he will respond, he will hear, and he will answer. The answer means he will act. He will act. God will hear and answer them, even the one who sits enthroned from of old, with whom there is no change and who do not fear God. And now in the end of verse 19, he is saying this is all about the bad guys, the evil Ahithophel that wants to murder David. God will answer not only me, but he will answer them. And he starts describing them. There's no change in them. There's no movement toward God in these people. And that's why he says, as for me, I will worship God. I will turn to Yahweh as my deliverer, but these people don't and won't, and I want you to wipe them off the face of the earth. He says they don't change, they don't fear you, God. In verse 20, he's put forth his hands against those who were at peace with him. He has violated his covenant. I think David is speaking of his friend Ahithophel here. He's the one who has put his hands against David, a man who was at peace with him. Wonderful, spiritual, godly peace. And he has violated his covenant. Now, I'll say something silly that, as men, we talk about the man code, right? Nobody knows what it is. But we talk about the man code. So maybe sometimes a man tells you something and it's just expected that you don't tell that to your wife. There's a man code. You don't tell on each other. It's a silly thing. I'm only using that as an analogy to jump to what David and Ahithophel had. They had a spiritually Yahweh-fearing, worshipful code that they lived by. They were brothers. They were confidants one to the other. They worshiped God together. This is a very, very serious and intimate relationship. There was an unspoken agreement between the two men. See, I'd never have to tell Clay, don't ever betray me. I'd never have to say that to him, and he'd never have to say that to me. It's unspoken. If Clay Jackson needs something, I'm there. If I need something, Clay is there. Without question, without hesitation, it's done. And that's an unspoken covenant that David says, my friend has broken. His speech was smoother than butter, flattering tongue, smoother than butter, this Ahithophel. I don't know, did Ahithophel pull the wool over David's eyes? Was he as close a confidant as David thought he was? I would think he was, because David's no dummy. He accepted him as that. But he says his speech was smoother than butter, but his heart was war. He held a grudge. And when the time came and he could get back at me, he got back at me. His words were softer than oil, yet they were drawn swords. As soon as he could get back at me, as soon as he could seek his revenge, he sought it. He didn't let go of the grudge. Cast your burden, he says in verse 22. He tells us, cast your burden on Yahweh. Great advice from David. When you find yourself in turmoil, in a circumstance that's high pressure, the highest pressure you could imagine, what is King David's advice? Having gone through this event, this historical event in his life, what does he conclude after the fact when he sits down to write a psalm? I should have from the beginning, and I'm telling you to, cast your burden upon Yahweh and He will sustain you. He will never allow the righteous to be shaken. So David is, as if David is saying, I should have never had a worry in the world. He has brought me through fights with giants, Goliath. He's brought me through my father-in-law trying to throw a spear at me in his own chambers 3 times. He's brought me through all kinds of life-threatening events. Why would it be different today? Why did he react the way he did instead of casting his burdens upon the Lord because He cares for him? We have the same command in 1 Peter. Cast your burden upon Yahweh and He will sustain you. He will never allow the righteous to be shaken, but you, O God, speaking of the wicked, will bring them down to the pit of destruction. David didn't have to plead with God to handle the wicked and the evil on earth. I promise you, God will handle the wicked and evil on earth. In His time, God wins. Emphatically. In His own timing, God and His Son, Jesus Christ, win it all. And the wicked and the evil will be wiped off this planet the way David wanted God to do it. God will do it His way and in His time. So he tells them in the end, vengeance is God's. God protects and provides for the righteous. He will destroy the wicked in His time. David didn't have to worry. But you, O God, will bring them down to the pit of destruction. Men of bloodshed, men of deceit will not live out half their days. But I will trust in you. No more trembling fear, no more terror, no more overwhelming anxiety. He gets to the end and he says, I will trust in you the way I should have from the beginning of this song, from the beginning of this event. I should have gone to you in prayer, should have tried to understand this through your plan. I should have trusted you the way I have in every other circumstance you've brought me through. But he doesn't. I'll give you two more Psalms. I'm just going to give you the numbers of them so you can go and read them. Psalm 51 and Psalm 38 are also Psalms that David writes that speak of his sin against God. I'm not trying to bring King David down. He was a mighty man, a man after God's own heart. God's assessment of David after his whole life was, he's a man after my own heart. It doesn't get any better than that. But he was human nonetheless, and he had bad days. He had bad reactions to circumstances sometimes, and so do you. Does that okay it? Does that make it okay for us to react emotionally the way David did at the beginning? Does that make it okay for us? Well, King David did it, so I can do it. Or should we go to the last part, starting in verse 16 in the Psalm, and think the way David did there? In the promise-keeping God who says, I'll never leave you, never forsake you. All of those things that He's promised us. Food for thought. Let's go to the Lord in closing prayer.